How does a 90-year-old stay young? I'm Tanya Hall with ZDNet, and we're going to find out from Peter Weingard, who's the Chief Marketing Officer at New York Public Radio. Welcome, Peter.
Hi, Tanya. Great to be on your show.
All right. Well, and thanks for joining us to talk about this topic of I can't think of a company that would better talk about digital transformation than a media company who's been around for 90 plus years. In fact, your station and network have been around for the most of the 20th century. So what are some of the significant milestones in technology like FM and taking the market away from AM that you've seen throughout this time?
Right. Well, when you talk about digital transformation, I can think of no media company that's done it better than New York Public Radio. We are one of the largest public radio groups here in New York City, in the United States, based in New York. We run WNYC, WQXR, which is a classical music station, and we started recently WNYC Studios, which is a big podcast production house. But if you look back at our history, we're 93 years old, and if you walk around the office here, we look very much like a startup in a lot of ways, because we're reinventing what radio means in real time here in really amazing ways. And I think a lot of media businesses are in fact technology businesses at their heart. So they've always undergone an evolution. So radio, for example, has its roots in radio manufacturing, right? RCA, which made radios, also started the first radio network, NBC. So you'd have content for the radio. We are also actually, you mentioned AM and FM. We have here in New York, we're the very first commercial FM station, WQXR. The X in the call letters actually stands for experimental. And I think the original call letters were something like 2XR. But broadcasting itself, which has remained pretty consistent even with the advent of FM transmission, has been pretty much the same business for a long time. But what's happened in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s was several things at once. One was, of course, the mobile revolution. Everybody started walking around with smartphones, and that basically means everybody has a radio in their pocket. The other thing that happened was, the PC revolution and all that went with that meant audiences became fragmented, and the distribution methods that had made broadcast valuable in the early days of its, or say in most of its history, had been disintermediated. You can no longer have that direct connection between the broadcaster and the end user. But in that change, also opened up an opportunity for stations like ours to change what we were doing, interrupt ourselves or disrupt ourselves, and take advantage of these new platforms, podcasting being the most visible part of that. And we disrupted ourselves not just by taking our programming and putting it online, but actually creating new types of programming to take advantage of that form factor. And if you listen to the kinds of stuff that we produce at WNYC Studios, including, the Two Dope Queens, our LGBTQ podcast, Nancy, we just today introduced a brand new podcast for kids. It doesn't sound anything like what you traditionally heard over the air. It doesn't sound like All Things Considered Morning Edition. So in that, we've been able to reinvent the kinds of content we do, and that's been really exhilarating.
You have been historically a membership-driven business. How much of your revenue is still driven by memberships?
About a third is membership, and we feel that blended revenue model is really important. A lot of media companies, you just read the news today, they're all finding themselves in a lot of trouble if they've relied primarily on sponsorship and advertising because, for a number of reasons, that market is turned down, and there's no sign of it ever really turning around. TV being the latest sort of big media platform to suffer the sort of the ongoing collapse of advertising supported content production. So one big piece of our business is news. Journalism is a very expensive proposition, and because we're a nonprofit mission-driven company, we can afford to invest in things that aren't, say, commercially viable for an advertiser-only supported network. So that blend of having philanthropy, membership, and sponsorship gives us the flexibility to create the kind of programming that you wouldn't get on a lot of other media companies.
So podcast, clearly you're talking about a podcast that you launched today. It's a huge part of your business model. Does that mean that terrestrial radio is no longer relevant, or are you just seeing a completely new vertical as being an added value?
I wouldn't say added value. I'd say what's happening is we are reinventing what traditional broadcast is. Um, Radio is still extremely relevant, and in fact, we've had our highest ratings ever just recently. So while a lot of radio stations in America are seeing their audiences decline, actually ours is on the rise, and on the rise with younger and more diverse audiences. Part of that is due, in fact, that people want news at this time in our nation's history that is unbiased and fact-based and trustworthy. But what we're looking at is what is the value that radio provides to a local community. Broadcast, terrestrial radio is very much a local proposition, unlike our podcast business, which is global. And there is a need in every community for people to gather and share ideas and learn about what's going on in their local community. And we very much want to be and see ourselves as being the communer of the New York conversation, that this is the place to come to hear what's important to New Yorkers by New Yorkers. And what we're starting to do is turn ourselves from a medium that just transmits information to one that actually receives it as well. So engaging our community with the news, with the conversations, is very much a part of what we do. Later, if I get a chance to give you a little tour, I'll show you the green space, the Jerome L. Green performance space in the ground floor of our building here, where we invite people to come in and watch live broadcasts of the Brian Lair Show and ask questions of our mayor when he's a guest and other guests. So it's very much a part of embedding ourselves into the community of New York.
You talked a little bit about, reaching a millennial audience. Aren't you really our dad's podcast network? Are you really reaching millennials today?
Yeah, well, the dads don't listen to podcasts. It is very much a young person's medium. The average age, or I should say the biggest sort of group of listeners is between 24 and 35 years old. Interestingly, in a recent study that was done by Edison Research, WNYC Studios audience is younger than podcast audiences generally. And I think that's due to some of the programming that we've been producing that is not just reformatting old radio shows, which would be basically your dad's podcast. If I took, a 20-year-old radio show and just started distributing it as podcast content, but we're actually creating new original content by millennials for millennials.
You guys don't have any commercial. Traditionally, public radio is commercial free. Does that give you an advantage over some of your competition? Or how would you measure that?
Well, we do have sponsorship. There's sponsorship on air in the form of underwriting announcements, and there's sponsorship in podcasts, which has a very similar kind of presentation as we have on the air. So we do have commercial support. But unlike a lot of commercial media, we've been very careful not to load up our programming with lots of ads. Generally, in a podcast, you have one at the beginning and then maybe one in the middle, depending on how long it is. So there's very little interruption. And research shows that podcast audience generally enjoys the advertising because it's not terribly interruptive. We're very careful about what advertisers we decide to work with, and they have to pay for that ability to reach a sort of a valuable audience in an uncluttered environment. And as a result, our audience listens to the ads, which is something that you couldn't say for an audience that's, the cord cutters and the ad blockers.
Well, I'm a cord cutter, and I do listen to your wonderful podcast. Thanks again for joining us, Peter, and kind of giving us some insight to how you guys have transformed traditional terrestrial radio and podcasting and gone beyond being our father's network. If somebody wants to follow you or your new shows, how should they go about doing that?
Well, you could follow me at P Weingard, and you could follow us at at WNYC Studios.
Well, there you go. And I'm Tanya Hall. You can find more of my shows and interviews on Tech Republic and ZDNet, or find me on Twitter at Tanya Hall Radio, or Facebook by searching for The Tanya Hall Show.